It's my pleasure for now the second year running to host the FDA Chief Chat. So the next hour we're going to be taking on a number of different topics. I don't have to introduce this esteemed panel, but I know, Rob, I think you've already been introduced and everybody knows you. Mark, I think you've already been introduced. So I'll just take a few minutes to quickly introduce Janet, Scott, and Peggy. And hello, Janet, and hello, Peggy. Thank you very much for joining us remotely in this hybrid session. So Janet Woodcock is basically an institution at the FDA, trained in internal medicine. Janet joined the FDA in 1986. Now with over 30 years with the agency, Janet has been repeatedly recognized for her leadership in shaping the modern FDA that we know of today. She was acting FDA commissioner from 21 to 22 and is currently serving as the principal deputy commissioner under Rob. Scott, sitting two over from my left, Scott Gottlieb served as the 23rd commissioner of the FDA from 2017 to 2019. He is a strong supporter in private sector innovation, as a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a partner at the VC firm NEA, and a board member for several private sector companies. Dr. Gottlieb is often published and interviewed by the media, and in 2021, I'm sure many of us have read Scott's authored Uncontrolled Spread, detailing the rise of COVID-19. And then lastly, Peggy Hamburg is one of the longest tenures of FDA commissioners, serving for 6 years under Obama. As FDA commissioner, she was known for advancing regulatory science, streamlining and modernizing FDA's regulatory pathways, and of course the globalization of the industry. And thanks to Peggy, we're all here today. The FDA CERSI program was initiated under her leadership. After the FDA, she has kept a global focus as the Foreign Secretary of the National Academy of Medicine, and now helping lead many well-known international organizations and initiatives. Gentlemen, ladies, both here and remotely, thank you very much for your willingness to participate in this panel. We're hoping that this one goes really well again this year so that you're willing to come again next year. So we have a number of topics, and the ground rules here are to not speak for more than 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, and I have the great task of trying to keep you within line. So let's be provocative. Please don't hesitate to jump in and interrupt, particularly if you have something that is in disagreement with something that one of the previous commissioners has said. So Rob, I'm going to start with you, and we're going to talk about a topic that you've been quite vocal and public about, which is our need, not just interest, but need to build, or maybe say rebuild, trust with the public with respect to science and public institutions like the FDA. I don't have to go through the statistics, but we know that we're in a very difficult place. We bounced back a little bit on our trust meters with COVID, but we're starting now to add back to a difficult place. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how you're seeing this play out in your tenure.
Yeah, as I've already mentioned today, I actually believe that misinformation is the leading cause of death right now in the U.S. because whether we're looking at COVID or chronic disease, people are making bad choices driven by the information that they get in a situation where we were just not prepared for what broad access to the internet would do to communication channels. Just as a good example, I'd point you to Celine Gounder's thing she wrote in the New York Times today about her husband, the soccer guy who had a ruptured aortic aneurysm, and that's gotten all over the internet as a side effect of vaccination, which is completely absurd. But how is a person out there just reading a feed supposed to tell the difference? I'm going to be very short on this and just say I've talked to all the experts in the world I can find. No one knows what to do to get this moving in the right direction. And I look to my colleagues to give us some good advice here about how to handle it.
Well, Scott, that's a perfect tee up for you based on our conversation leading into this, Scott, because you have an idea.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to be here. I was supposed to be here the year that I was in the FDA seat, and Congress shut down the government, so I couldn't come. So Rob had the good fortune that Congress was otherwise preoccupied this week and couldn't shut down the federal government, so he got to make it out here. Just thinking about social media and misinformation in those channels, we obviously grappled with it when we were at FDA as well, but not on anything this scale that we've seen over the course of the pandemic. And my general approach was that when there was misinformation about FDA's policies or FDA's actions, that we had to respond quickly because the information cycle was very fast. I remember when I worked with Mark as a senior advisor to Mark, we used to try to get our policies sort of wrapped up by 4 or 5 o'clock so we can make the evening news. Literally, we were thinking about a 24-hour news cycle and how to get above the fold in the newspaper the next day. When I came back to the agency as commissioner, we recognized that we basically had an hour to respond to something. And if we didn't respond within an hour or two, it was going to be viral across social media, it'd be on TV, on cable news, and we'd lose control of the ability to shape the narrative. And so when it came to issues around FDA policies where there was misinformation, I weighed in pretty aggressively, or I had the agency do it in some fashion. I wouldn't let it sit out there. And I used Twitter for that. I responded very directly, and the virtue of Twitter for me was that it didn't have to go through clearance. Nobody cleared my tweets. The department didn't need to see it. The White House didn't clear it. It was my communications. No one was going to regulate my speech, and so I just spoke directly. I had people look at it. I wasn't completely shooting from the hip. I had some good people around me, Lauren Silver, others who used to look at things before I put it out, but it allowed us a way to respond quickly. But my view was generally if it was a product-specific issue, we generally didn't weigh in because we thought that it was the job of the sponsor to defend their products. We've seen FDA weigh in admirably around some dangerous disinformation on specific products in setting the pandemic, but that can't be the business of the FDA. And what I think needs to happen is I think sponsors need to be given some more latitude to be able to respond directly to true misinformation, things that are false and misleading in the marketplace. There needs to be a standard for speech that allows sponsors to respond quickly based on clinical experience, substantial clinical experience, real-world evidence that doesn't necessarily rise to the kind of standard that you would require for something that goes into the label. FDA could create a safe harbor for sponsors to be able to respond to misinformation. They can certainly put guidelines around it. You can't create a new intended use. You have to be replying to clear false, misleading statements. You have to, reply within a similar channel. You have to base it on substantial clinical experiences, some other standard of evidence that allows you to use real-world evidence. But I think if sponsors aren't given the ability to respond quickly to this misinformation in the marketplace, keeping in mind that a drug maker or any medical product manufacturer is going to be slow to begin with in terms of just orienting their own internal communications, but then you superimpose the regulatory considerations, you get the lawyers involved, and they end up not responding. And so we've been dependent upon the public health community to weigh in these settings, and that's hit or miss. And also I think that the adversity that individuals face weighing in response to some of this misinformation has been so extreme in situations. And Rob referenced the op-ed today in the New York Times, which I think evidence is one of those specific scenarios that you see a lot of people pulling back right now. And I don't think that we get to be dependent upon the broader community to play the role of traffic cop trying to respond to the scope of the misinformation that's in the market. So the key to me is rapid response. I think sponsors need to have the ability to defend their products in the marketplace of ideas when there's true misinformation. And I think FDA can define in guidance a limited safe harbor that would allow more speech to take place in these settings. They've done it in the setting, for example, when it comes to payer communications. They've created a limited safe harbor with certain guardrails around it. They've done it with respect to being able to respond to solicited requests for information from providers around potentially off-label uses of products. So there is precedent for the FDA doing this. I do think we need to think about a different framework for communications if we're going to create a marketplace for good ideas to respond to a lot of the deliberate misinformation that we're seeing.
Maybe, Janet, I can bring you into this conversation because you led FDA during a period when science was coming under rapid fire from outside people, and you were on record for saying that you were pessimistic about the situation improving unless we could really rally together to educate and teach the world, our country, and show them the big picture. So maybe some of your thoughts in terms of whether you remain pessimistic or optimistic.
I remain pessimistic. I like Scott's idea. I had to twist quite a bit of arms, Scott, to get, the medical information piece, direct inquiries about off-label uses and stuff. But I do think that would provide a much larger community who could respond. Now, many of the sponsors are going to be very slow to respond. They have their own fleets of lawyers and so forth. But, I think just the few public health agencies that exist are not going to be able to adequately refute or, communicate alternative, truthful information in a way that will be accessible to all these folk through all these different channels. So I think the more people who are communicating valid information, the better it'll be.
Yeah.
But I am somewhat pessimistic because much of this is tied up in, objectives, political or other objectives that are not straightforward.
So as scientists, it's difficult to be part of this dialogue, but what are the ramifications from, if we just think about drug approvals, what are the ramifications? Mark, Peggy, any of the commissioners?
Well, I'll jump in if I may, because I think it's really important to put this conversation that so far has been really looking at these big societal concerns, the divisiveness of the political climate, the sort of demonization of expertise in many ways, the discounting of science and evidence in critical and distressing ways. Those are all hugely important issues, and I think has been noted, driven, really dangerously by social media, the 24-hour news cycle, and the really concerted efforts by some to take and distort important narratives that matter for health. But I think the FDA also is at a critical inflection point in terms of really doing everything it can to ensure that there's trust and confidence in the FDA as an agency and in fulfilling its critical and really quite unique mission. And there, I think, there are concrete steps that can be taken and, have over time been taken. But I think we all know in our different commissionerships how important it is every single day to work to demonstrate trustworthiness and to really undertake efforts to demonstrate why FDA matters, how FDA does its work, really opening up some of the things that historically have been viewed as, sort of black box. And, when you don't understand something, you're often more suspicious. It's harder and harder, I think, to do some of the important work of FDA in terms of building that trust and confidence in an ongoing way because of the swirl of misinformation, disinformation, detractors, and the political environment. But I think, that also is something that has to be worked on every single day, working with all of FDA's stakeholders and partners, so that despite so much that's going on that is hard for FDA to control, the work of the agency and its trustworthiness can be demonstrated.
Good.
Yeah.
Can I try?
Please.
Mark, you haven't
So I was
spoken, so
just
go
going
ahead.
to add a couple of points on here. One is agreeing with Peggy about the importance of FDA building up trust, but I also think just realistically, FDA needs help. The chief medical officer of the Maine Association for State and Local Public Health Authorities recently said, and I'm paraphrasing it, look, we need other spokesmen now. People just don't have a lot of trust in our public health officials. And if you look at where trust still resides, it's in people as physicians, the healthcare providers they know, other leaders in their community, people who are close to their experience. We talked about that some this morning. It does seem like FDA might be able to help with both of these issues, to Peggy's point, by maybe focusing a bit more on how they can be transparent about issues where there is controversy. And while, transmitters and viruses is not something that has any scientific credibility, there are some, as Rob mentioned this morning, a lot of the issues, especially in a public health emergency, don't necessarily have fully fleshed out definitive answers, and so the heat level tends to rise. FDA does have mechanisms for dealing with this, like advisory councils that can bring together a number of different perspectives, air it out all in publicly, and has a great voice. Maybe I like Scott's idea for reinforcing with manufacturers operating within the label of their products, but focusing on how that information can be made more effectively available to healthcare providers, to local community organizations who have not been as effective of voices either in some of these debates, and maybe feeling like they're on the defensive too. So I'd like to see some more focus on how you get this information out to other groups that are more trusted in important public health issues.
Yeah, I mean, you want to?
Just a couple of quick comments on the comments. First of all, Scott, you have a propensity for doing this, but I've been thinking about trying to do exactly what you described, because it's a rare turnabout, actually, that the internet has 24/7 freedom, but those whose products are being vilified have their hands tied because of all the regulations and issues that they worry about. Now, how to navigate that, that's a whole different issue we can talk about later. But this is a meeting that includes academia and industry. I think the group that's letting us down the most right now, this won't surprise people who know me since I lived my life there, is the universities. I thought universities were created to find the truth and to promote it, but where are they? Why aren't they, spending a lot more time and energy? Tax breaks that universities get are amazing, but what are they doing about the problem that's killing so many Americans? Yet we have, great universities in every state. They're like afraid to talk about it. So I really hope that those of you who are here from universities will look inward a little bit at your own institutions with their big endowments and all the other things that they have, and have them put some more energy into this.
Oh, great. Well, before you chime in, Scott, let me just mention to everybody that Slido's available. So if you're in an academic institution and you agree or disagree with that comment, please share your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, just picking up.
Yeah, well, if I could.
Oh, please, Janet, please.
Yeah, the group that is the groups that are very trusted and actually are aligned to a great extent with FDA are the patient groups. And where we have support there, which is fairly broad, they also are relatively trusted, but only within those realms of, people who are ill or have different diseases. So I think part of the issue is when you get into prevention or treatment of very common diseases where there isn't a lot of advocacy, then really misinformation can proliferate.
Yeah, I mean, just picking up what Mark said, I think that it's going to be important for public health institutions to get more support from the general clinical community, and for public health institutions to engage clinicians more. I think that they can be important voices to advance the public health goals of agencies like FDA and CDC. And, historically, there's been a lot of sort of fighting within the family between academic and the clinical community and institutions, and that's been very healthy because I think it's, forced agencies like FDA to advance their policies in ways that were responsive to the clinical community, responsive to patients. But we're in a very different environment right now, Janet, to your point, and I'm somewhat, a little bit not very optimistic about the future as well, because I think we're in for at least one and probably a couple of political cycles where there is going to be, to a large portion of the political class, upside in running against public health and running against public health agencies and running against public health advice. And you're going to see more corrosion on some of the goals that we try to advance collectively before we start to see things improve. And so it's going to be important, I think, to Mark's point, to probably get better alignment between public health institutions, public health officials, and the clinical community where there are shared goals on behalf of patients.
I can't resist expanding on that just a second. In academia, there's a lot of benefit from critiquing the agencies that we all depend on.
Yeah.
And I don't want to in any way suppress the fact that, as a public agency, we need to be critiqued. But I think often the people that are doing the critiquing assume that the agency's going to be there in the future in the way that they expect it to be there. So they're critiquing it to make it better. But to a lot of unsuspecting people that hear it, it just completely erodes their belief in the institution. And I think it's every bit as much in play in vaccine hesitancy right now. That is, the people who actually believe in the institutions not thinking that they have to be careful how they provide their criticism and the impact that it has on sort of middle-of-the-road Americans who are just trying to decide who to believe and what the truth is.
And it's tough because science is hypothesis generating, and many of the hypotheses that we generate are just not true, but it's the process that leads to
Yeah, I mean, the
isolation
most
of the
fun
truth.
parts of my career have been the, heated arguments in academic meetings at professional societies or whatever. But when you do that on the internet in front of an audience of 1 billion people,
Yeah.
you got to be careful about the
Yeah,
impact you have.
and fake news spreads at
You do have to be careful, but just arguing the other side, I'm not sure that there's someone else who's going to be able to take up that mantle very effectively. FDA does a great job of providing transparency around new products where there are controversies about them and airing out different science-based views about what should be done with a clinical decision on a product. It hasn't done that as much for what should clinicians be talking to their patients about with respect to this product or this area of care and the misinformation that's out there.
But if
about
I'm
it.
hearing you right, what you're saying is the agency potentially should lean more heavily on some of the tools that they already use, like advisory committees, engaging the clinical community in a public setting around more aspects of the work, policy, bottom line, product decisions. I mean, this is albeit it's coming from a person who's not on Twitter, but
Well, I'm also not on Twitter, but I do think that, one lesson from COVID and the way the FDA handled, what was an escalating set of concerns and really paranoia about the COVID vaccines that were being developed was to open it up, to be very clear about what the standards were going to be for assessment of safety and efficacy, what the process was going to be in terms of engagement of independent experts and scientists, having the advisory committees where the data was made available and there was open discussion. There were the anti-vaxxers who were dug in and already had been, espousing anti-vaccine messages, and they, weren't particularly interested. But there was another substantial subset of people who were genuinely concerned about, were these vaccines going to be safe? This new, untested mRNA vaccine technology, the whole Operation Warp Speed moniker, and was the vaccine development being accelerated so fast that it couldn't be trusted. And then, of course, the political context of how the vaccine and its development might be used for political purposes. So I think that when FDA kind of, put its line in the sand and sort of laid out how it was professionally and responsibly going to address it, I think it really made a difference, bringing a lot of people along. Nothing is perfect, but I think it is an example of how, clarity of process and transparency can make a real difference.
Yeah, engaged the advisory committees and got public alignment around those. That's right. I mean, it was a very public process as well.
I want us to move on to another topic, but I want to do a quick poll, and I'm going to end with you, Rob, and I'm not going to make this a referendum of your leadership, but if we look out a year, will public trust in FDA be higher or lower? We'll start with you, Peggy.
Well, that's hard really to answer because many of the variables are not within Rob or Janet's or the leadership of FDA's control. This is going to be a challenging year. I think Scott touched on it. I mean, the political environment is out to get public health agencies and public health professionals in many ways, and the FDA is certainly on that radar screen. So efforts will be complicated.
You're saying lower. That's a lower. Janet?
No, I'm not saying lower. I'm saying it's going to be a challenge, and that I have great faith in my colleagues in leadership at FDA, but but it isn't, many of the aspects of it are things that are outside their control. Many of them are things where they can make a real difference, and I know they're going to try hard.
Janet?
I think there'll be a slight rise in public
Oh, good.
confidence.
Excellent. Mark?
I think it's tough, but that's all the more reason for FDA to rely on mobilizing some of these partners, clinicians, academics, business, people who have a shared interest, if you can make it simple and clear and transparent on what's the most important information to get out.
Is that a vote for present?
That's a vote for tougher for FDA, but maybe more help.
Okay. Scott?
Yeah, look, I think it's going to be lower, but I don't think the environment is necessarily aimed at FDA, and I don't think that what's going to come is aimed at FDA. I think FDA as an institution has come out of this better than a lot of other public health institutions. I think FDA is being degraded by a general erosion in trust of public health, and we're going to go through a political cycle where there will be multiple national politicians campaigning against public health going into the next political cycle. So it's going to get worse before it gets better. And it's not
Lower.
FDA per se.
Lower. And breaking the tie, Rob?
No, it's going to be lower unless the public health, academic, and practice communities wake up. And, that is a very large part of the American public. Yeah. And I just think, those that trained and operate in the environment just assume that these things are going to be okay somehow.
Yeah.
But they're not. They are really under risk. What you call a political cycle could end up with people who actually don't believe in public health in charge of public health.
These things become generational, yes.
Well, thank you, and thanks for the rallying cry. We all need to step up. It's not just on your and Janet's shoulder. Janet, let's switch topics and maybe start with you, if you don't mind. We're coming off of a period of just incredible success, rapid drug development, great transparency, a lot of that emanating from FDA, but also that interface of FDA and industry, just immense collaboration. How do we keep that going, particularly in light of the optics of collaboration between FDA and stakeholders in industry?
Yeah, so we've certainly had a lot of opinions expressed on that very recently and specific around specific products. I think that some of the streamlining that we have seen is bound to continue. And so I believe that good communication, you might say, between the FDA and the industry will continue, and probably that many of the innovations that were put in place to allow COVID products to be developed, particularly in clinical trials and so forth, will continue. But nobody can continue at the same pace that we were doing over the last 3 years. And so of course, FDA is now going to be absorbing the new requirements of various user fees in the medical product side, and is also facing a big evaluation over on the food and tobacco sides. So I think the agency has a great deal to do. It's not going to rest on its laurels on the medical product side, but I believe that the engine that is really going to drive medical products is science. In that scientific advances are just going to keep accelerating as they have been. And the real challenge isn't just really collaboration, it's keeping up with the science.
Yeah. Anybody else? Opportunities for better interaction?
I certainly agree with what Janet was saying, and that the environment with respect to advances in science and technology is extraordinary, and we really have an obligation to make sure that gets harnessed into the development and availability of critical products. I guess I see this question as a little bit bigger than just the regulators working with industry. I see it as really more of a whole of society, maybe even more global than that, commitment to really making sure that those advances in science translate into real world products that will make a difference. What we saw with COVID in the sense of urgency and collaboration was bigger. The public-private partnership, was more significant. to really make sure that progress was made. And I think you look at all the unmet public health and medical care needs and the opportunities to make a difference. And, we're not stepping up to the plate enough. We're not, really making sure that products that will really address the ongoing burden of disease are being adequately developed and as swiftly developed. And so I think we need to, hold everybody's feet to the fire to make sure that we're investing the resources, we're creating the conditions to get the work done, we're supporting the workforce necessary, and, really getting the job done.
I think a lot of the time savings that was enabled by the EUA authorities, because we think about this in the context of the emergency use authorizations and what it enabled, and will those flexibilities carry on once the public health emergency has passed into other clinical areas. And I think a lot of the most immediate benefit of the EUA authority is it allowed FDA to backload a lot of the CMC work. Because, if you were going to distribute a vaccine that was going to be used immediately, you didn't need to do 12 months of stability testing to make sure it could be, sit on the store shelf at CVS. It wasn't going to sit on the store shelf. So I think that allowed them to move the approvals, the authorizations much more quickly. But a lot of the intangible stuff, which is the frequent and early interactions and the feedback and the continuous dialogue, that isn't necessarily dependent upon the EUA authority. That could persist. It's a question of resources and how you prioritize your resources in areas where you're going to have the most public health impact by allocating those exceptional resources, because you can't do it across your whole portfolio unless Congress is going to fund FDA in a way that it hasn't. Historically, we've thought of allocating the higher level of touch in areas of unmet medical need. I think we should also think going forward about doing that around not just clinical areas, but also platforms. Product platforms that have the ability to be disruptive, N-of-1 studies, TILs we were talking about, cancer vaccines. We have sort of a new area of technology which could potentially be disruptive across multiple therapeutic areas, thinking about applying a higher level of touch there, because that's, I think that's been some of the challenge around cell and gene therapy. We didn't work out a lot of the product-specific issues early enough. We don't work them out quickly enough on an ongoing basis that it becomes an impediment to a lot of the clinical advance in those spaces.
How do we change the curve there, actually, and get to a point where we can work through those issues more rapidly?
Well, I mean, I'll leave it to people who are thinking about this currently, but I would just say, we've always thought about allocating the resources on, again, based on unmet medical needs, therapeutic areas, rare diseases. And part of that was because that's a way you can galvanize the public behind an effort. You can galvanize Congress, you can galvanize patient groups. It's hard to say we need a lot of resources to operationalize, a certain platform against N-of-1 genetic, rare diseases. It's not sort of a category of diseases. It's a product platform. I would start thinking about reorienting the resources that you try to get for this higher level of touch around disruptive technology areas that cut across multiple therapeutic spaces.
Well, don't forget, Scott, most of the resources that the medical product centers get are ones that industry supports because they're user fee related. Yep. So we're going to see a big surge in resources for cell and gene therapy and so forth because of that. And I think that's probably appropriate for the reasons you said. That area has finally come of age and really needs a lot of attention and effort.
Right.
But in other areas, it's just scientific interest, like the N-of-1. Everybody's very interested in it. We put a lot of effort into that for that reason.
I mean, I guess my argument there would be we're finally getting the resources because there's finally been enough progress that you have enough constituents that are invested in the space to sort of aggregate the resources to do that. We should be looking at early technologies where there's not necessarily a lot of people already in it, because those are going to be the disruptive. And it might be hard to pick the winners and losers in those spaces, but that's That's something I think FDA might be uniquely suited to do, to try to advance truly disruptive, what it perceives as disruptive platforms, where there isn't a lot of investment capital already in those spaces, to try to galvanize the development of that science.
The resources are now there for cell and gene, but it's still a very bespoke industry in terms of manufacturing process, platforms, development, and it seems like, to Scott's point, I think you were saying this too, is having more of a focus on developing reliable manufacturing platforms and more standard approaches, which I think is maybe part of the new user fees, but something where there's maybe a public health interest that transcends the ego of individual companies is important to pay attention to.
I think
CERSI
Peggy
is working with NIH on that. I mean, there is a partnership going on.
Peggy, if you go ahead, and then Rob has a comment after you.
I think also, I mean, this is an incredibly important point. And I think also, trying to get out in front of some of the advances in science and technology in terms of thinking about what will be the appropriate regulatory framework. And again, doing that in partnership with industry and the academic scientific community to really try to be anticipatory of what some of these disruptive technologies, new platforms, and new products are really going to look like, and the challenges that come with products that don't fit with the historic way that FDA has done regulatory oversight.
Well, just a couple of quick comments. Your original question was industry FDA interaction. I'm not at all worried about it. It's going to happen because it has to, and it's been very successful. I feel like I always need to remind people who aren't directly involved in this that there was a time when a lot of really stupid applications were sent in for drug approval or device approval that had no hope of getting through. That's all been preempted now by the fact there's so many meetings and discussions during development that if it's the only things that get submitted are things that have a reasonable chance of getting through because they've gotten to that stage. There is, I mean, it's interesting, the use of the word bespoke, and Scott, your idea, there actually is, as I think you know, the Bespoke Gene Therapy Consortium now, which is totally focused on the N of one example, which is just one of many examples. But what really bothers me, there's a great need in that arena, but there's almost nothing being done about common chronic disease in a country where we're going the wrong direction in our big health parameters. What is the set of resources and strategies that would be effective for dealing with that?
This is an issue that I wanted to bring up here too, where I do think overall the news is good from the COVID experience in terms of manufacturer, FDA interaction and accelerated pathways, more discussion and clarity about what it takes to get to approval. But in this process, I think we're increasingly losing sight of the end goal here, which is effective use of therapies have an impact on population health. If you look at the COVID products themselves, the vaccines, the antivirals, the tests, great process for getting them to the market under emergency authorizations. Not so good in terms of uptake and routine use, even today.
It's about two other countries in high-income countries.
So there's certainly a component of misinformation to this, but I think raising the question of what kind of steps can FDA take to make it easier to develop claims that are maybe more relevant to actual real-world use in populations could help here. So addressing misinformation would help, but so might ways of helping health systems see how they can use these products effectively to reach underserved populations and so forth. And a lot of the FDA work on real-world evidence is focusing on things like label expansion, but it hasn't yet translated into a whole lot of clear, practically relevant guidance to get over questions like, okay, this new product in the market is going to cost 10 times as much as available therapies. Why not do utilization review or prior authorization first to go through all of those? Where's the evidence that we can go straight to these alternative treatments for at least certain segments of the population? Or how do we get to effective therapy for a particular patient in a population faster? Another example of this, look at the Hep C therapies. They're available now. Some states, including Louisiana and Washington, have figured out how to change the pricing for them so that the marginal price for an additional patient treated in Medicaid or in their prison system is zero. And the obstacle here is not the price, it's the delivery system's capability to have like a primary care practice do screening and treatment at the same time and then oversee therapy without having to refer to a hepatologist. So those kinds of questions are just not getting answered all that effectively, and it applies for like the next pandemic, the next public health emergency threat. We're going to have diagnostics, treatments, and hopefully vaccines all pretty fast, thanks to what we've learned in this process.
You're optimistic.
But we're not. I'm not sure we're going to have the impact on population
Well,
health.
so let's go to the accelerating innovation to patients, which is a hallmark of the healthcare system in the United States. And we've seen immense progress through the COVID pandemic. In oncology, we've seen immense progress. And in other areas, rare diseases.
Cardiovascular drugs, they're better than ever, Rob. I mean, there's probably more that we could be doing, or new treatments for diabetes.
We're
and
great
slow
at
down
accelerating
diabetes
for the well-to-do and the highly knowledgeable. We're the worst of any high-income country at accelerating for the average
Why,
population.
and what can we do about it?
Well, I mean, I was intrigued by the way Mark said it. It was like, okay, I'll agree the FDA has things it could do better, but this is not primarily an FDA issue, I don't think.
I think it's partly an FDA issue on is the FDA regulatory process facilitating the right kind of evidence to assure access in real
Okay,
world
bingo.
populations.
We agree completely on that. You know that. That's still, you made the point that wouldn't solve the problem, because hepatitis C, we have a miraculous treatment that 2 states figured out how to give for free, and it's still not being given because the
Still have
hepatologists in the primary care
than we did in
community.
2014.
I think
yeah.
Peggy, were you about to say something, Peggy, or am I misreading?
Oh, I was just going to comment that, FDA has plenty on its plate in terms of what it needs to get done, but it can also be more proactive in helping to shape products that go into development. I mean, I think about, some of the instances where FDA pushed, for example, to help make Narcan that was could be administered on site available, pushing industry to actually, create that auto-inject product, thinking about how FDA can early on help shape the kinds of characteristics of certain products so they might be more accessible to certain populations. And then, of course, how they're studied, what questions are asked, and ultimately how information is communicated about those products makes a difference too. So, FDA does sit in this unique position to be able to sort of look out at what's the unmet need and also, what's in the pipeline and work with companies to shape the R&D process and identify areas of product development. So, I think that should be part of the thinking as well.
In addition to just improvements on the delivery side, are you arguing that there should be equal, if not more, investment towards primary care conditions, trying to develop better drugs for more routine kinds of chronic diseases like diabetes, like cardiovascular disease?
I apologize for being a sports nut, but if you got a basketball team and the guards are not playing very well, that might be a team that I know pretty well at this point in a university NCAA play. You wouldn't focus on the forwards, you'd focus on the guards. We are losing ground in this country compared to our economic peers in common chronic disease and in the opioid overdose. I just want to get in one quick thing here. There's a public health emergency on opioids, right? That's been seeing the EUAs on opioids. Maybe that's a strategy we should be using to get industry more interested in innovation in that arena.
I want to pause for a second, just a show of hands in the audience if you know the basketball team that Dr. Califf is referring to. Oh, pretty good. Okay, good.
Well, I didn't understand the analogy, so I'm not even. I will just say, again, not to be even more pessimistic, I think that the Inflation Reduction Act is going to create additional disincentives for trying to develop drugs for routine primary care conditions. And so we've now taken a big step in
Why?
the opposite
Because
direction.
they affect typically elderly.
Well, because if you're developing a small
individuals?
molecule drug for a broad indication, we're facing an environment where, ramps are much slower. It's hard to get on formularies. You're going to face a battle getting on formularies. You get on formularies, and then you have 4 years of patent life left for a drug where you had to do a randomized study in 60,000 patients against active therapy because you have to show an improvement against an active comparator. So I think the economics of that, we've made it more difficult to make those investments.
I think this is one of the basic, I don't think it's just the IRA, but I think this is one of the basic challenges with public health in the 21st century, especially in a country like the United States that hasn't historically had a strong primary care health system, which is that we increasingly have technologies available that could be used early if they're targeted to the right patients and if we have supportive delivery systems for interventions, but we're just not doing a good job of it. Every American, I think most every American, has now heard the phrase test to treat in the context of what should be done about COVID. But if you think about every common chronic disease, and I'd put opioid use disorder in this category as well as hypertension, diabetes, you name it, we have that same potential. We're just not very good at doing it. And if the public health enterprise can't figure out a better way to support healthcare and getting the evidence they need and support they need to doing that, we're missing out on a real opportunity for partnership.
It's so polite. If we were, for those of you who follow Ted Lasso, if we were in the soccer league, we would be relegated to the next league down based on our performance.
You opened up the Pandora's box, Scott, which is the IRA. I have one question for you erudite individuals. Why do we differentiate between a small molecule and a recombinant protein? One gets 9 years before it is forced to undergo price regulation, and the other gets 13.
It's bad public policy. We've created
why?
incentives to actually go make investments in the drugs that are going to be more expensive to distribute and harder to get access to. So
Right.
I know why it happened
Harder to
politically. I know
genericize.
how it got.
Yeah, why?
I mean, I know how it got negotiated
Why are you looking at me?
in the House, but I think the people who ultimately negotiated that lost sight of exactly what you're getting at, which is you probably want to create incentives to small molecules that are more accessible,
Yeah.
at lower cost. So.
Janet, I'm sorry.
Conti,
Janet, were you going to say something or no? I'm sorry. Okay, Mark, go
I
ahead.
just say what Rena Conti, the way she phrased it this morning was, look, there are products where you would expect if they've on the market for a certain period of time, there would be competition to bring the prices down, and this was sort of intended. I'm not, saying I'm justifying the law, but this was intended to fix that problem.
Yeah, but he's talking about the disparity between the injectables.
So I guess so two things here. One is, having been there, and you were too, Scott actually did a stint at CMS. He didn't like it that much, so he ended up leaving pretty soon. But he was there when we were trying to implement Medicare Part D, and what was absolutely critical at the time was an extensive process for public transparency. Remember, that law passed at the end of 2003, so this transparent process with public engagement around proposed regulations and a whole bunch of potentially controversial details in the law had to take place during a presidential election, or people in the administration were like, it's probably not a good set of topics to discuss right now. Fortunately, the president wasn't one of them. He said, people are going to criticize this law no matter what happens. At least they'll be out there talking about it, get your regs out. We have like thousands of pages of regs, got tons of great comments, hired some of our most critical commenters to help get the law right. Right now, we're at a similar stage with the IRA for stuff that hasn't been done before. What does this all mean? How is it going to play out? Rena's view this morning was, the sky is not falling, this is limited, but I can understand why people may have different views because there isn't any clarity yet. So that's really important for CMS
Well, there's no
to
public
do
process, and they're
this
not going to
year.
do rulemaking.
They could. They could.
Unless Congress makes them do it,
so-
they're not going to.
So that's one issue. Let's wait and see. Ask us next year about this. But the other issue that I think people are losing sight of too is just how big the changes in Medicare Part D and the IRA are. And those are bipartisan legislative proposals, essentially. We worked on for probably a decade with Grassley and Wyden and others. So that means no more than $2,000 out of pocket, nothing almost out of pocket if you're low income in Medicare for some of the most expensive therapies, a lot more pressure on the drug plans and the manufacturers to be accountable for the costs at the high end. So that potentially is going to create some changes. And there hasn't been much discussion yet of what seniors are going to see first in the IRA, which is how much their high-cost drugs are going to look less expensive if those provisions get implemented effectively. And that's not necessarily easy to do. There are also some constraints on, the drug plans can't raise premiums, even though they're providing more generous coverage by more than a certain percentage, and so forth. And those are all issues that need to be worked out this year and that could have a very positive impact on access to drugs and thinking about more effective use of drugs.
You're going to see them close formularies further as a way to make the numbers work. So
again, we gotta see how this plays out.
Rob, I'm going to bring the conversation away from you two. Rob, do you see the evolution to regulatory decision-making and reimbursement be kind of coalescing, or do you think we'll continue to see, at least in the states, independence?
I wouldn't use the word coalesce. I mean, I've used the baton handoff analogy, which I think needs to be kept. I think the FDA needs to have its focus where it is, but with an eye towards that the baton's going to need to be handed off. And the point was already made today. There are extensive interactions between FDA and CMS on the issues that you're raising. It's not our call. We're consultants in that effort. So, no, I don't see coalescence. I don't think the European approach would ever work in America, but there is something rational about saying you have, safety and effectiveness, then you have a technology assessment, what does it mean for society, and then you have payers who are not trying to do the technology assessment when they have a conflict of interest on that.
But do you think that that it would help understanding and appreciating in an accelerated approval path if you somehow were to link reimbursement with an accelerated versus a full approval?
So you're asking my opinion versus policy, so I have to be very careful there.
Right.
I do think that there's a lot of wisdom in the idea that if you haven't proven that you're effective, that the price shouldn't be as high as if you have proven that you're. That just makes so much sense.
I agree with Rob. I agree with Rob on that. Yeah.
I just want Janet to expand, and then we'll come back to you, Scott, because Janet, it feels that with all the great stuff that happened during the pandemic and all the acceleration, everything that happened in oncology over the last 5 to 10 years, we're starting to see retrenchment of this. At least my sense, we're seeing in oncology, we're seeing a little bit of a pause on the accelerated approval. We saw this with Aduhelm. However you think about this was a bold move to rapidly bring an Alzheimer's therapy to patients and then figure out precisely whether it's working. We're starting to see that move backwards a little bit in my mind. Where do you see the pendulum swinging?
Well, I think these things swing back and forth in the public mind. I think that in oncology, it was going to be inevitable that eventually we would have a lot of treatments. And so not every treatment would be for an unmet medical need. And so they're going to, which is good in some areas, get more into the area where the question I think that Mark was raising, what treatment do you use? What is a treatment program? How much evidence do we have about, what is good for any individual patient changes? But I don't think, I think accelerated approval, there's going to be the naysayers, the people who are saying we aren't using it enough. That's been going on ever since that was put into place, and I don't think it's changed that much.
Yeah, just 2 quick points. One, I agree with you wholeheartedly about, if you get accelerated approval, once you demonstrate that you provide benefit against clinical endpoint, it should be priced differently. Problem is you can't reprice a drug in the marketplace, right? Once you launch a drug, you can take a 2% price increase year over year, but you can't fundamentally reprice it based on new evidence. The other thing I would say is that,
why not, though? There's no
why not? Right.
reason
You could change the policies to allow for that, but it needs to be explicit, and that needs to be a public policy solution, which I would wholeheartedly agree with. I think everyone in this panel would. The other thing I would say is that, I'll give an anecdote. When we were at FDA, state of Massachusetts, Republican governor wanted to come out with a policy basically saying they weren't going to pay in the Medicaid program for any drug that came through accelerated approval. CMS sent them a very spirited letter saying you can't do that, it violates the program. I had talked to SEMA before that happened. We very jealously guarded the the prerogative of people to try to set coverage policies based on whether it was approved or given accelerated approval. I fear that CMS, having now declared that because it's accelerated approval, thus it doesn't need to be paid, that's a bridge we're not going to be able to walk back on. We're going to see more and more state Medicaid plans do it. We're going to see private payers do it. And it's going to degrade the value of accelerated approval very quickly. And sponsors just won't come through it. The only sponsors who will come through it are those who, don't have capital to pursue a full approval.
I'm having a flashback to like 25 years ago. We were in a debate, and you're very effective. But let me just say,
I remember that one.
You do remember.
Well, you put me. I collapsed. I shrunk. You pounded me.
But I don't think it's going to turn out the way you did, but only because if it's allowed to continue that way, what you said is true. But we have a situation today, you know this quite well. First question when someone has a new idea for a therapeutic, can it be used for a rare disease or cancer?
Yeah.
Can it get into that accelerated approval? And in addition, as you said about the IRA, if what you say is right there, we have a whole set of things which are saying, do not develop treatments for the biggest diseases that are causing the most death and disability in our society.
I think
people are going to realize that, and we're going to have to find some middle ground here.
I think the incentives are changing. I think you're going to see companies make more investments in large molecules against intermediate indications, specialty indications, but not rare diseases and not broad applications.
And this is an area where the IRA really is going to force some additional action. So you can't, under the IRA inflation penalties, substantially increase the price of your drug unless there's some kind of clear regulatory exception process and to force people to deal with that. You also couldn't price your drug the way that the Hep C manufacturers did for Louisiana and other states. It's a low kind of subscription price for the population, not a high price for each individual use of the drug. So low price, high quantity, rather than the other way around. Unless CMS does take some steps working, I think this is an area where I'm not sure it's quite a relay handoff. I mean, the FDA's got a huge amount of interest in post-market evidence development here. So this is an area where we need further work.
All right. So this panel could go on for hours and be exciting, but for 10 minutes, the timekeeper in front of me has had a sign up that says 2 minutes left. So you guys have stopped time.
So there's 2 minutes left.
I know, you have stopped time. So I'm going to take one question from the audience, and then we're going to go into a quick lightning round. And the question it's a little funny. So does the FDA have a press secretary that could do spots on the evening news like the weather report? That's a yes or no question. Do you have a press secretary?
You said could.
Yeah.
The answer is yes. We have an amazing external affairs leader who you guys know, Erica Jefferson.
Can you give a rendition of what that would look like the weather report, an FDA update like the weather report? As you can see here.
I mean, we do that every day internally. I know you all of us have done it. It would be very easy to do.
Good.
But that would assume that the press was interested in the FDA doing it, which I think the press is not very interested in having us do that.
Well, you never know. All right.
It depends on how humorous we were. We could say, well, today we expect some tsunamis, okay? One will occur in the medical device area. We also expect a sucking out of the tide in the infant formula area, and there'll be a stretch of sea level. Maybe I could do this, Rob.
I think you just need to use more of your hands. And as you can see here, all right.
Well, it doesn't come with a wardrobe allowance.
All right. Peggy, if it's okay, I'll start with you, then we'll go to you, Janet, and then back through the table to you, Rob. And the question for the lightning round, and really a 15, 30-second answer is, what major event over the course of this year do you predict will have the most impact on regulatory policy on healthcare? You define it however you like.
Did you say what knee-jerk event?
No. I said major event, but if there's a knee-jerk event, then...
That is an odd question. Well, I mean, I think this is going to be an interesting year. I think there's going to be a huge coming together of science and engineering and information technology in important ways. I think, we're going to start to see some some advances in key areas, CRISPR products, for example. What I can't predict, but I think could be, as Scott puts it, disruptive, is what are some of these generative AI technologies and other advanced information technologies, what impact are they going to have as the year and the future unfolds?
Terrific. Thank you, Peggy. Janet?
Well, unfortunately, I can't talk about it.
Brilliant. We'll wait for that to happen.
Yeah.
Mark?
Yeah, well, if we can get Janet on the evening weather report, that would definitely make the news. But maybe three things: Inflation Reduction Act implementation. We talked about some critical issues that will or won't come together in the next year there. Maybe another public health emergency, hopefully not a big genetic drift for COVID variants or something like that. But as everybody here knows, you don't control your own agenda, and the FDA is right at the center of the nation's and the world's public health. And I do think the Alzheimer's drugs, the Alzheimer's monoclonals, are going to force some level of reckoning around, can we find a way to provide access and develop much better evidence to fill a lot of the gaps that exist there, and ultimately, hopefully get treatments that work to a lot more people who would actually benefit from them.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that about the Alzheimer's drug. It's the last organ that we really hadn't figured out how to drug in terms of understanding the underlying biology of the brain, and we're starting to figure that out. These are the early innings. I think there's going to be incremental data coming out this year. Hopefully that'll be positive. That'll show that we're at least targeting the right biological pathways, even if we're not fundamentally altering them at this point, but we're able to target them successfully. I think the biggest issue is still going to be the political environment, though. I see it in my social media feeds. The amount of physical threats being made is unprecedented. I think the ire directed at the public health community that will spill over to FDA is unprecedented. It's going to impact hiring and other things for the agency. And there's a reason why you see people in the political leadership espousing anti-vax views. It isn't that they're necessarily anti-vaxxers. They understand it sells in a large part of the electorate, and the portion in which it's selling is growing. And it's not just with the vaccines, it's a broader assault on public health. And to Rob's point earlier, this does become generational. It becomes hard to reverse some of these opinions, and so we're going to have a lot of work to do.
Great, thank you. And take us home, Rob.
First of all, I'm amazed that Janet would pick the sucking sound on the tide of infant formula, since she's the one that did the Abbott recall the day I was confirmed, I'll tell you. But
You're perfectly welcome, Rob.
But the thing I'm 100% sure of is that there will be some event that we have no idea is going to happen that will have the biggest impact on us, which I think probably, I think all of you would agree it's one of the most amazing things about being FDA commissioner. You actually don't come into work, you just get a feed at 5 a.m. that tells you almost every day a whole bunch of things you never imagined could have possibly happened, but they do. What I hope for that will be the major event really relates back to what Scott said. I think, you just made me want to resign today because you predicted a terrible year ahead for the FDA. But I think it may be the case that this gets bad enough that people do wake up and that we do come up with a strategy where like-minded people in the medical, scientific, health, educational communities find some common ground to counteract the insanity, which is deeply rooted historically in every society, and people have mistrust and feel that they have been hurt and misused and not respected. And unless we figure out how to deal with that, I'm afraid Scott might be right.
All right, I guess we end on a somewhat pessimistic note. But I am going to say, Janet, that you all will have to come back again next year. And Janet, you'll have to tell us whether the event that you're thinking in your mind that you can't tell us actually happened over the course of the year. So a big round of applause and a big thanks for our chiefs.